Okay, thank you. I'm going to be very brief because the time these folks came to see our speaker, not me. But I'm going to do an introduction here. For those of you who are not in the class, welcome. Thank you for coming. Class folks, thank you very much. We'll get your grades out shortly. Okay, here we go. Newt Gingrich was first elected to Congress in 1978, where he served the 6th District of Georgia for 20 years. In 1995, he's elected Speaker, where he served until 1999. In 1995, he was Time Magazine's Man of the Year. He's recognized internationally as an expert on world history, military issues, international affairs. He has published 9 books, including the bestsellers, Contract with America, To Renew America, and his most recent book, Winning the Future, A 21st Century Contract with America. And you can buy it right outside because the bookstore people are out there. Speaker Gingrich, we're very happy to have you.
Thank you
for coming.
Thank you all very much. I'm delighted to be here, and I want to have a dialogue. So what I want to do is outline a couple of ideas rather than give you a long lecture, and then just go at it and let you raise or talk back and forth and explore together. And let me tell you part of why I want to approach it this way. I spend about 40% of my time on national security and about 40% on health. And I spend time with the State Department, the intelligence community, the White House, the Defense Department. And then on the other side, look at questions that range from personal health care all the way up through an avian flu or a biological attack. And I helped found the Center for Health Transformation. And you can see all this if you go to my personal website is the easiest way to sort of explore all this. It's just my first name, just newt.org. But we work across this whole range of issues. And I've tried since I left the speakership to understand sort of where we are and what's happened to us. And to give you just a little bit of background, my dad was a career soldier. We were stationed, I was born in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. We were stationed in Orléans, France in 1957-58. This was a period when the French Fourth Republic was dying. They had 100% inflation. They still had World War II bomb damage. They were fighting a war in Algeria, which they were losing, having already lost the war in Vietnam. And literally while I was there, the French Fourth Republic was killed by the paratroopers, and Charles de Gaulle was brought back and created the Fifth Republic, which is the system France has had ever since. In the spring of 1958, my dad took us to the battlefield of Verdun, which was the largest battle in the First World War on the Western Front. 600,000 men were killed over a 9-month period in this huge valley outside the city of Verdun. And we stayed with a friend of his who'd gone on the Bataan Death March and had spent 3.5 years in the Japanese prison camp after the fall of the Philippines. So we spent all day looking at the cost of war and then all evening listening to stories about the cost of defeat. And I was going to become either a vertebrate paleontologist or a zoo director. And I spent all summer sort of thinking and praying about what I had seen in the spring. We were transferred to Stuttgart, Germany, which was the 7th Army headquarters. And in my sophomore year in high school, I decided that I would try to understand what does it take a country to survive, and what does its leadership have to do to survive? So in one way, I've now been doing this. I've been thinking about this actively for 48 years. This is my current summary because it evolves over time. The world changes, your understanding of it changes. This is my current summary of where we are, and it relates directly to globalization, which is why I was delighted to have a chance to come and share ideas with you and learn from you. We are, as a country, in an intersection we don't understand. And the only analogy I can give you that I think is close is 1861 in April, when Abraham Lincoln, in response to the firing on Fort Sumter, called for 75,000 volunteers for 90 days. Now, in 1861, the entire United States Army was 16,000 officers and men. So 75,000 sounded huge. That was 5 times the size of the existing army. And no one went into the White House and said, you know, President Lincoln, if you're really serious about preserving the Union, it's going to take 4 years. You're going to build a transcontinental railroad. You're going to create the Homestead Act. You're going to run out of gold and end up printing paper money. You're going to send 10,000 federal troops into New York City to suppress 3 days of riots. You will lock up over half the Maryland legislature and keep them locked up for years. And you'll only have 660,000 Americans killed in the most expensive war we've ever fought. I mean, it was inconceivable here to imagine the scale it was going to take to get to here. Now, I'm not suggesting that we're faced with that, but we may be in a different kind of way. And so what I want to walk you through is the world you're going to live in your lifetime. And I'm going to just give you a series of facts that you can sort of add up, that become an equation, if you will. Number one, barring an enormous war that collapses our civilization, you will have between 4 and 7 times as much scientific knowledge in the next 25 years as you had in the last 25. These are literal numbers. Now, there are more scientists alive today than in all of human history combined. They have better computers and instrumentation every year. They're connected by cell phone and email. They're then connected by licensing, venture capital, and royalties. They're then connected to India and China as reserve centers of production. Now, I used to just say it was 4 times as much, but I gave a talk to the National Academy of Sciences Working Group on Computation and Information. And afterwards, the chairman came up to me and said, that's too low. He said, it's got to be at least 7 times. Michael Novacek, who's the chief scientist at the American Museum of Natural History, believes it's going to be 10 times, but that's because he's in paleontology. And that's an area which is a lagging indicator. That there was so little money spent on paleontology that it's only now catching up with the rest of the field. So I want to stick at 4 to 7. Now, let me share with you what this means at a practical human level so you can begin to understand the challenges you'll face. If you were a planning group trying to imagine Iowa in 2031, and we have 4 times the rate of change we had in the last 25 years, you are the equivalent of a group sitting in 1880 trying to imagine 2006. Now, 1880 is pre-automobile, pre-airplane, pre-long-distance telephone, pre-electric light, pre-motion picture, pre-television, pre-radio. I mean, to show you how desperate it was, it's pre-iPod. And imagine you literally could not, which means all of our current planning models are inadequate to the acceptance of new knowledge and acceptance of new rate of change. It also means our whole concept of education will just be blown apart. Because it means you'll never have a final degree. You have to think about continuous learning for your entire lifetime in a way that nobody's ever organized. And it'll almost certainly be online, 24/7, demand pooled, and almost certainly within a generation include the virtual system I just saw upstairs. And things will happen we could never have dreamed of, and they'll be normal. And you know they'll be normal because that's what you live in, right? You get in a car, you turn on your cell phone. If you have a car, how many of you have a car that has GPS? Anybody here have GPS in your car yet? Okay. So you plug in where you want to go. The car tells you how to get there. You know, turn right in 200 yards. And just think about this. And you don't think it's magic. And, you know, my wife occasionally, I probably shouldn't say this since we're webcasting, but my wife occasionally will be emailing me on her BlackBerry while she's driving. It terrifies me. I can't break her of it. You know, she'll go, traffic is slow. And I know she's tempted to be talking on her hands-free phone while emailing as she drives. It truly frightens me. But you take it for granted because there's a great letter, one of my favorite letters about change, is a woman who wrote Wernher von Braun when he was the head of the moon project, building the Saturn rocket at Huntsville. And she wrote him and she said, you should quit trying to leave the earth. It's a violation of our religion. You should stay home and watch television the way God intended. Because she'd absorbed the technology of television. Okay, so box 1 I want you to be aware of is the unending, enormous, continuing pressure for change, which I believe means we have to have very fundamental reform of math and science learning at the basic levels, because we are not producing enough Americans who are capable of competing in the 21st century. And this is a very profound structural problem. The second challenge is the rise of China and India. These are not threats. Let me be very clear. China and India are not threats to us. They're not our natural enemies. We don't have to exaggerate, but they're going to be enormous competitors. Now, to give you a sense of scale, from sometime around 1840 on, we were the largest economy in the world. And we have consistently had the advantage of being the largest economy in the world. So we're the best place to innovate. We're the best place to introduce new markets. The reason we could drown the Germans and the Japanese was we could literally outproduce them. The United States by 1944 was producing more airplanes than everybody else in the world combined. We just drowned them. The reason we could contain the Soviet Empire is 90% of the scientists and engineers lived in the free world. It was inevitable at some point, if you just held the Soviet Union at bay long enough, they couldn't possibly compete. All of a sudden, for the first time in modern history, we're going to have two first-class competitors. And they should be. I mean, if you truly believe in our Declaration of Independence and you believe that we are endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, an active verb, then why don't the Chinese and Indians have the same right to pursue happiness? And if you had 1,300,000,000 Chinese pursuing happiness, given the background of a Confucian culture with a high commitment to education and a high commitment to work, they're going to be real competitors. And so you have to think about, so what would America, I think we're really at a binary point in our history. We're either going to decide to profoundly transform our institutions to be competitive, or we're going to decide that it ain't a big deal and you can decay elegantly for a long time. I was in France 2 years ago, and part of the crisis of French civilization is this exact decision. Because the Western Europeans came out of the First World War exhausted, lived through the Great Depression, lived through the Second World War, then lived through the Cold War as an immediate, intimate, personal experience. And they're frankly very tired. They're culturally just tired. And I was in Paris at a meeting in September 2004, and I was telling some folks there, I'd been walking on the Seine River from the Eiffel Tower down to the Jardin des Plantes, and I was remembering being there with my mother back in 1959, and I was thinking about all the things that had happened since 1959. And I said, it was so beautiful today. And there were two businesswomen and a businessman. The one woman said to me, oh, you should come back in the summer. The city's empty. Now, being an old timer, I said, oh, you mean August vacation? She said, oh, no. We now have a 35-hour work week. And we enforce it by requiring you to take 11 and a half days of vacation in addition to your 5 weeks of vacation, in addition to your national holidays. And so everybody takes the 11 and a half days in the summer. So in any given week in Paris in the summer, 2/3 of the city is on vacation. The woman next to her said, I am an entrepreneur. And I thought, Silicon Valley, 80-hour weeks, the kind of time I bet you guys are putting in to try to get the botany program to work in the cave upstairs. She said, it's even better. As long as my company is profitable, I never return from my house in Spain. The man next to them said, you need to understand, the #1 book on French Amazon in the summer of 2004 was a book called Au Bon Vacances, which is a 123-page outline of how to exploit French labor law so that you never have to work while collecting a check. And the woman who wrote it, this is her theory. It's not a bad theory. Her theory was France is dominated by an oligarch of people who go to these elite schools, and they are exploiting the rest of us. Therefore, we morally owe it to them to counter-exploit them. Now, she has since been investigated by her employer, but I want to put in context why you saw recent rioting in France over the idea that you'd have temporary employment for young people. Here's a country that has 24% unemployment for people under 30. Staggering numbers. But the system is so rigid that it understands that any fundamental change threatens to change the whole system. And so people who have no job protest against a law that would give them a job. And just giving this as a flavor, because this is a great cultural change. I believe analytically, if we're going to compete with China and India and not follow the French, we are going to have to transform litigation, regulation, taxation, education, health, and energy. And that is a lot. It's going to mean 10 or 15 or 20 years of among the most complex reforms we've ever been through as a country. It's going to mean a national dialogue that's very difficult. And the first reaction is going to be to say, there's got to be an easy way to hide from this. So China and India are the second big reality you face. The third big reality you face is that we are in a long war with the irreconcilable wing of Islam. This is part of globalization. 50 years ago, if people wanted to live in a totally repressive society where they executed homosexuals and they totally repressed women, we would have said that was sad, but we wouldn't have noticed it. Now the people who live in those and I describe specifically the irreconcilable wing, which is about 5 or 6% of Islam, which is 65 to 80 million people. But if you look at the Taliban in Afghanistan, if you look at Saudi Arabia, if you look at the actual behavior of the dictatorship in Iran, these are people whose worldview is incompatible with this room. Not a single woman would be allowed in here. Let's just start with that. So you understand, this is real. This is not a game. This is not political rhetoric. It's a fundamental difference about the future, and it's important for two reasons. You live in a worldwide community in which people travel and communicate all day, every day, worldwide, so it's very hard to say, well, let's just isolate them over in the corner and not worry about it. Because they're not happy being isolated over in the corner, and they come here. Which is why you've had a Dutch television producer killed in Amsterdam. You've had bombs go off in London. You had riots against Danish cartoons. Because it's essentially a genuine war of identity. And wars of identity are different than wars of interest. Wars of interest you can negotiate. Wars of identity, one side wins and the other loses. So you're likely to be in for turmoil, I think, I think the long war will take 50 to 70 to 100 years to win, but you may see turmoil over things like Iran that transform your life, that change dramatically where you're at. I mean, one of the things that is very clear as a national strategy is we have to start strategically minimizing the importance of the Persian Gulf. That it is an enormous weakness for us to be financing the Iranians with a high price of oil. That's what we're doing. And so grand strategies aren't always military. Grand strategies can be cultural, they can be economic, they can have they can be scientific. The last point I want to make, just to give you this broad flavor, well, I'll take two more. The whole issue of the border and immigration is a function of the same globalization. I am very pro legal immigration. I am also very pro controlling the borders. You can't describe national security in a world where you can drive a truck with a nuclear weapon across the border. It just makes a joke of the idea that you're defending yourself. So you have a very vivid interest in controlling the border. You also have a very vivid interest in ensuring that people who are talented who want to come to America can get here. But we currently have a system where you could be getting a PhD in advanced math at MIT and not be able to get a visa to stay, while somebody who has a third-grade education can sneak across the border and stay illegally. I mean, that system is just goofy. And it's been built on two big lies. This is not about illegal immigrants. That's the number one mistake Washington's made. This is about American businesses who break the law hiring people illegally. And it's about an American government which has for 20 years refused to enforce the law. Because if you had law enforcement and if you had a real commitment to people becoming American citizens, and if people felt comfortable about it, you wouldn't have an issue. This country has historically absorbed lots of people. But we absorbed them by saying you actually became an American. And that's going to be a real debate in your lifetime, because if you say, well, I don't really care and we don't really have to control the border and I don't care if people come in illegally, as word spreads planet-wide of the relative difference in the income you can earn here versus any place in the third world, people would be crazy to stay home. So it's not the first 11 million, it's the third 11 million. And there's no reason to believe that's going to change until you're prepared to have real changes, and real changes are going to be hard, and which gets me to my last big point. Your generation, and you'll see this in a paper called 21st Century Entrepreneurial Public Management, your generation has to face the fact that the models of government bureaucracy we've inherited are dead. They are gone. The first place that's had the courage to say this is the Senate committee which reviewed Katrina and called for replacing FEMA. It's an enormously important thing. The fact that Senator Collins and Senator Lieberman on a bipartisan basis said, don't try to fix it, replace it, is a very important breaking point in where we are as a country. Now, let me give you the model that I'm using so you understand how, and I got to this model not off of Katrina. I got to this model because in December of 2004, I took 53 hours of briefings on the global war on terror and on Iraq, trying to understand what was not working. And when if you get lots of briefings in a short period, you actually can remember what you're learning, and you can piece together things that come from briefing 9 and briefing 17. which you can't do if you take them over 2 or 6 months. So I really just immersed myself and spent all day getting briefed. The model I now believe we have, think of it as a box. This is a box. This is your local school board, your county commission, your city council, your state government, and your federal government. The box is characterized by a male clerk sitting on a high stool using a quill pen dipped into an open inkwell. These are the Civil Service Acts, which are now 125 years old and are the base of all American government personnel. Just hopelessly obsolete. Now, the box has been modernized by a 1935 paper bureaucracy in which a manual typewriter types on carbon paper. And my conclusion looking at that, I saw Vice President Cheney and Secretary Rice and Secretary Rumsfeld in August before Katrina. And I said, we're going to have a catastrophe. This system can't function. It cannot work at the speed of the modern world. Now, let's look at Katrina. In Katrina, the state of Louisiana failed, the city of New Orleans failed, and the government of the United States failed. And the word failure is important. You're not trying to improve something that's working. They failed. Let me give you examples so you can render your own judgment. When an American body sits on a street on television for 3 days because the government can't organize picking up the dead, that's a failure. When 34 senior citizens are abandoned in a nursing home and no one knows they're there and they drowned, that's a failure. When 22,000 people go in the Superdome and are trapped without water while the private sector has water trucks out front and the government cannot figure out how to get the water in the buildings, that's a failure. And let me assure you, when you see in September of this year how far we've come, it'll be a massive failure. Compared to the Chicago fire of 1881, the Galveston hurricane of 1900, or the San Francisco earthquake of 1906, we will have less work done because we absorb so much time and energy in planning sessions with bureaucracies that are incompetent. And because we have procurement systems that are insane. The United States government to put on 10 cents of blue tarp on roofs that are torn up. The U.S. government signed contracts to pay $1.75 to a prime contractor who paid 75 cents to a contractor, who paid 35 cents to a subcontractor, who paid 10 cents to the person doing the roofing. It's insane. It's impossible. Now, what happens is relatively smart people say, yeah, this is not working, but they try to find a solution inside the framework of the system that they're in charge of. So we have in our paper, we have a little dotted line that's above the box, and they come in and they have an announcement. Plastic quill pens. Big winner. Better carbon paper. You're going to love it. And that's why when I watch them tell me that they're ready for hurricane season this year, I don't believe them. If they tell me that they're ready for, the avian flu, I don't believe. The same people who were reassuring them about other things, it's the same basic behaviors. Now, where we have to go is based on an Einstein quote. Einstein once said, insanity is when you think that by doing more of what you're already doing, you'll get a different result. This is a very useful thing for you all to think about in terms of your own lives. Insanity is when you think that by doing more of what you're already doing, you'll get a different result. Now, we produce from that what I think is the most important slogan of the next 20 years, which is real change requires real change. So if you really want an energy policy that isn't dependent on Saudi Arabia, Venezuela, and Nigeria, you need a new energy policy. You don't need a slight tweak of the failure. If you want schools to produce people who can actually do math and science in large numbers, you need a radical new approach to thinking about math and science and learning. If you want to make sure that everybody who graduates from here can actually keep up with the flood of new knowledge, you better think about an entirely new continuing learning system that is online, real-time, and demand pool. These are not just doing slightly better the old order. Now, we characterize it as a circle. We describe it as 21st century intelligent, effective government, unlimited government. And our concept is the 21st century intelligent, effective, limited government is an entirely new model. This is a replacement system, not a repair system. This doesn't get you a slightly better post office. Now, I'm going to give you a handful of quick examples, and let me ask you, how many of you use them? Because I want you to understand that what I'm describing is derived from the real world, not theory. UPS. How many of you ever used UPS? Okay. FedEx. How many of you use FedEx? Have any of you ever gone online to track your package? What you think about that? Couldn't find 34 senior citizens while they were dying, but we could have found the package that was being sent to them. Can't find 11 million illegals in the country, but we could find every package that was being sent to them. So one solution would be for the INS to mail something to everybody by FedEx and UPS. Dell Computing. Any of you ever encountered Dell Computing? Dell has such good real-time internal management systems that they can change their budget in real time during the day by a virtual conference in which their senior management communicates about market and price. So they have daily capacity to change prices. Google. How many of you have ever gone to Google? How many of you know what a Wikipedia is? I was quoted in Time magazine last week. I was talking about a Rio Wiki. And anybody know what a Rio is? It's a regional health information organization. And we've just launched, at the Center for Health Transformation, we joined 2 other groups, and we've launched a Rio Wiki, which the idea of anybody in public politics ever using a term like that, the reporter at Time thought was fascinating. He didn't have a clue what it meant, because he's too old. But have any of you actually entered material in a Wikipedia? Okay. Well, we've designed this because as people build regional health information organizations around the country, we want them all to be engaged in collaborating with ideas. And I don't know if you all do this with your virtual capabilities, but you ought to think about having a virtual wiki that you create with everybody across the whole country. Is there one? Good. Okay. Give me the address later on. I'll come on and give you my ideas. So, a couple more examples. eBay. Anybody here ever bought or sold on eBay? Imagine if the U.S. government procurement system was as lean and as fast as eBay. There's no reason it couldn't. If they're going to reinvent FEMA and have a brand new replacement model, one of the factors ought to be procurement from places like Walmart. I mean, you want really big systems that can deliver lots of stuff really fast? You want to surge out of the private sector. You don't want to have it stored in the public sector. Which is why if you want a virtual public health system, you start with 55,000 private sector drugstores that people know how to get to. And you integrate them from the ground up into the system. Couple more examples. Amazon. How many of you have ever used Amazon? All right. How many of you have a cell phone with a camera? So again, this is not theory. Think about turning every home health worker in the U.S. into a real-time virtual public health service, because when they went out to take care of the person with the ventilator, they also interviewed the other people in the family. And if they had somebody who had a problem, they could take their picture with a commercial cell phone that's very cheap, and they could send the picture to the doctor in real time and have a consultation while they were standing in the house. Imagine that every nursing home assistant had a cell phone, a commercial cell phone with a camera, not anything expensive. And at 2 in the morning, if grandmother's sick, they take her picture and send the data to the doctor in real time before they take grandmother to the emergency room. All doable. I went into a store the other day because I had to buy a new cell phone, and my old one had burned out. It had gotten too near some kind of radiation. And so I went in to buy a new cell phone. The cheapest cell phone in the store was $9.99. Now, it was a sensory-deprived product. It only had an old-fashioned ring. It had no camera. It did not have a color screen. I mean, for $9.99, you were down at the basics. But that cell phone would have been a miracle in 1978. Now it's just, oh, that's too cheap. I don't want that. That doesn't fit my. How many of you have a personalized ring? Okay. How many of you have rings that you personalize by the person calling you? My wife's call is a different call than anybody else for practical reasons, right? I mean, yeah. There are a lot of calls I can ignore. Then there's one I can't. So three more quick examples. How many of you have gotten money out of automatic teller machines? How many of you have gotten money outside the U.S. out of automatic teller machines? Okay. All right, now, this takes a little candor on your part. How many of you have ever gotten impatient waiting for the cash? All right, so hands start to go up. People up here are laughing, but they won't put their hand up. But you know what I'm talking about? You're standing there, you've gone to an anonymous machine, put in a plastic card, punched in a 4-number code. It's reached out 4,709 miles, found your bank, verified your account. validated the amount of money you have, changed it to the local currency at a slightly bad exchange rate, given you the cash. It took 11 seconds, and you were impatient. Here's an example of the box circle. It takes more weeks for the Small Business Administration to process an emergency loan than it takes seconds for you to get cash anywhere in the world. Just look at that difference in speed and pace. Okay. 2 last examples. How many of you use a credit card to pay for gasoline at self-service stations? Almost all of you, right? Okay, now this is one of my favorite questions. How many of you no longer get the receipt? Okay? How many of you get the receipt but don't keep it? This is my favorite group. I was in this group for 6 weeks. I was asking this question, and I suddenly realized that's me. And so I watched myself, because I tried to figure out what was I queuing off of. It was free. You know, you'd start to hang up the gas pump, and it would say, would you like a receipt? And I thought, why not? And then I'd get the, this is really true, then I'd get the receipt, and I'd go, I don't want this, that's stupid. And I'd wrap. So after I thought that through, for a little while I punched no until I realized there was a timer. If you don't do anything, it goes away. But that's an example of modernity, of getting into the modern. Now, okay, the hardcore group. How many of you get the receipts, keep them, and check them against your credit cards? When I talk to national audiences, I point out to them, this group is disproportionately from the upper Midwest. When you're dealing with the national, and it's true, people break up laughing, because of 2 reasons. One is ethnic, and the other is climate. The upper Midwest was disproportionately settled by Dutch, Germans, Swiss, Norwegians, and Swedes. And they all come from very heavily organized, structured environments where, you know, you get the receipt, you keep it in, you probably put it in a file that's orderly. You have it, right? She's nodding, yes, I know it. There's a second reason. In the upper Midwest, there is so much snow that around February people go, what do you think we ought to do Tuesday night? And they go, I know, we could get out the receipts and check them. Now, television is gradually breaking that pattern down, but it's comforting to know that it's still there for some of you. Okay, last example. How many of you use Travelocity or Expedia to get airline tickets or hotels? Okay. I want you to think about this, because this is the model of a 21st century intelligent, effective government, limited government. Real-time capability, available on demand, 24/7, you pull it forward. It enables you to be in control of when you're traveling, where you're traveling, which airline you're traveling on, what time you're traveling, the price you're paying, and you can assign your own seat. And you can then print out your own ticket. Now notice the speed of that. The reason I'm walking you through this is an America which decides that it's determined absolutely to get into a 21st century intelligent, effective, limited government, and decides it wants to transform litigation, regulation, taxation, education, health, and energy, I think without any doubt will be the leading country on the planet for the next century. Because it's inconceivable, even with their populations, that China and India could catch up to us if we were prepared to leave the broken systems of the past and move into it and become genuinely, aggressively competitive. Last couple of points. One, not read it, and you can get this at my website, newt.org. You should read John Pratt's Strong Inference. It's an article from Science Magazine in October of 1964, which I first got to because of Peter Drucker. And he basically argues that behind every major activity is a theoretical basis. It's a very elegant article, and it's well worth your reading, and I think you'll find that it really gets you to think about what you should be doing and how to do it. It's based on microbiology and high-energy physics, but it applies across the whole system. It's a point that Edwards Deming, the father of the quality movement, made, that behind every decision is a theory. And if you can be self-aware and develop the theory, it's worth it. 3 books you should get immediately and read. If you don't already have it, get Peter Drucker's The Effective Executive. It's 168 pages in paperback. It is the best book ever written on how to be effective. And it's by Peter Drucker, who was the leading analyst of business capabilities two books that relate to the kind of world you're going to move into. Glenn Reynolds has a new book out called An Army of Davids, which is a very elegant argument that computer power is enabling individuals to become David compared to large corporate structures or large bureaucratic structures. He writes Instapundit as a blogger. He is a law professor at the University of Tennessee. Very worthwhile book for you to look at. And Daniel Pink, who was an Al Gore speechwriter, wrote a terrific book called Free Agent Nation, where he actually studies how people think about things, and I strongly recommend it to you as a book on, or rather, he studies people who are independently employed. 24% of the country today is self-employed. And he goes out and he looks at what's the pattern of being self-employed and how do people do it. It really gets you to think differently and to be aware of different career tracks you could be on in your lifetime. So I've given you a sweeping overview. I am strategically an optimist because I believe just as the Galveston flood of 1900 was a major precursor to the progressive movement, which brought government out of the agricultural era into the urban industrial era, I think Katrina may be the breaking point after which we actually start to move government into a 21st century system. So I'm strategically an optimist, but I think we have an immense amount of work to do and a lot of real challenges. And if we can, let's go to questions, and I think they got microphones and what have you, so. You guys are in charge. The microphone people are in charge. There's a person up there who's eager and excited. And I just recommend if the microphone people would go back and forth, we won't have any lost walking time.
Hi. In terms of globalization, do you think that we have a chance to do that? And by that I mean, if you look at the nation and the world in terms of energy, look at a country like say, Russia and their major gas producer, say Gazprom, looking to try to consolidate, natural gas distribution throughout all of Europe. And so do you think that as energy becomes a much more critical piece of globalization, that when you have countries dominating it, they can set off more nationalistic tendencies that the countries that have the gas and oil will hold on to it, and the ones that don't will be scrambling. And so by that, for example, let's say that Russia does, with Gazprom, happen to control the major distribution of gas throughout most of Europe. You saw what they did to Ukraine earlier this year. What if that sets off a crisis in say, England, which then therefore holds on to Brent C crude, doesn't sell it on national markets, and all of a sudden everybody's scrambling for what's left? Won't that have a serious impact in terms of globalization? Because isn't globalization in the end dependent on free or very cheap energy?
Well, I mean, globalization doesn't necessarily require cheap energy, although it's helpful and it lowers the cost of living. Globalization requires a belief that being in a real market system improves everybody's life over not being in a real market system. And you're describing a return to a kind of autarky in which different countries suboptimize their advantages at the expense of the whole system, which in a way is what led to the Great Depression. That could happen. I think we have very significant energy challenges in the short run and probably have almost no energy challenges in the long run. And again, it's because of the wave of scientific knowledge that's coming. I think you're going to find that ethanol and biodiesel and wind and solar and other patterns dramatically accelerate in the near future. I think you're going to find that the next generation of very, very safe nuclear power is going to be very widely used around the world. There's a reason that one of the founders of Greenpeace said that looking at Kyoto and global warming, he now thinks that nuclear power is in fact a very, very useful thing to develop, and we clearly know how to build very, very safe reactors. I think you're going to find that we will get to a hydrogen economy. I think 2 auto companies are already talking about producing their first commercial fuel cell cars by 2010. So if you took that totality, I mean, our goal should be ultimately in the long run to return petrochemicals to feedstock for plastics and produce such a wide array of alternatives. Brazil now is basically entirely independent of the Persian Gulf. Brazil gets 50% of its energy from ethanol, and they get it from sugarcane, which is a higher energy yield than is corn. But they made a conscious decision years ago to become independent of the world oil market, and they've succeeded. And so I think the challenge for us is that not having had a national security strategy for energy, which should also be an environmental strategy, because there's a way to develop an energy strategy which maximizes biodiversity and which minimizes the risk of global warming, and to do so in a way which is also very, very good for us as a country and national security. And it's our interest to create so many options that Russia returns to being fine, you want to sell us the energy, fine. You don't want to sell us, that's fine too. But I do think that requires a strategic change, and I think you're right. In the short run, if for some reason the Russians the Saudis and the Venezuelans decided to disrupt the world system, they could have a very significant impact in the short run.
Before my question, I wanted to mention that I met you in Prague just after the Velvet Revolution at the ambassador's residence, and I wanted to tell the rest of the people that we were at a very fancy party where there were an enormous number of congressional delegation, and they were partying, but you were going around talking to all of us who were at the embassy, finding out what the situation in Prague was. And you worked that whole party, and I knew that you had the information at the end of it to go back and do the votes you needed to do. And so for that, I thank you.
Thank you.
My question is this: how do you deal with the politics of the change that you are talking about?
Well, I've written about this a couple times. I don't think you get really, really big changes in Washington, or for that matter, in the state capital here. I think capitals tend to be, combinations of lobbyists and immediate problems and a news media coverage that is startlingly parochial and immediate. So, I mean, if you watch our political news coverage, it verges on pathos at times. But America's been a country that's created long wave changes, and think about it. The rise of the revolutionary generation that decided they had to break with Great Britain, followed by the Federalists who decided that the Articles of Confederation didn't work and they had to write a constitution and create a government, which led to the Federalists being in charge very, very briefly, because in the Revolution of 1800, the Jeffersonian party of Democratic Republicans annihilated the Federalist, and what really was a revolution. The Jeffersonians basically run the country as an establishment oligarchy until 1828, when Andrew Jackson emerges and breaks the system apart on behalf of a rural and working class populism that in many ways decisively shaped America. Then you have a period of relative instability, as the political factions argue, until the rise of the Republicans and Lincoln, which is a disruption so big it leads to a civil war. Then you go back to a period of relative arguing and sort of stability until the progressive movement from 1900 to 1916, which dramatically changes the country. And there's no crisis, there's no Great Depression, there's no war, but the country talks to itself. And by 1912, the country was so committed to change that in a four-way race, the incumbent president only gets 24%, because he's seen as an anti-change symbol of the old order, and 76% of the voters vote for Wilson, Theodore Roosevelt, and Eugene Debs in the most decisive one-sided repudiation of the old order we've ever seen, bigger than the vote that Franklin Roosevelt got. Then you have, again, a period of relative stability until the Great Depression brings in Franklin Roosevelt. And then you have a period of relative stability until Ronald Reagan and the contract with America, which can be, I think, seen as part A and B of the same experience. Each of these is a long wave process where, frankly, talking with you gets us further down the road than talking in Washington. Because what happens is, over time, the American people talk to each other, and then as they begin to form conclusions, they say to their political elected officials, there are two futures: the one where you do what I want and the one where I defeat you. And I just need to know which future you're for. And I don't care about the lobbyists. I don't care about the PAC fundraising. I don't care. I want a better future. I want a government that operates like Travelocity and like my cell phone and like my ATM. And if you don't want to give me that because you're afraid of the interest groups, whether you're liberal, conservative, Republican, Democrat, I'm just sadly going to have to beat you. And we've done this now seven times in our history. But it takes time. Yes.
Do you believe repeal of the 16th Amendment is part of the change that we need to go through as a country?
I'm going to sound really ignorant. What is the 16th Amendment? Huh? Oh, I think it'd be nice to do it, but it's hard to do. I mean, if you ask me, as an ideal world, I would not have an income tax for a lot of reasons. But I don't think it's practical to get there. I mean, I can't imagine how we would do it in the near future. I would be for very radical tax simplification. And I actually think Steve Forbes has a very good idea, which he wrote in a book recently that I did the foreword for, which is to have an optional flat tax, where you'd have a one-page, this is how much I earned, this is a percent of it, here's the check. And you could look at that way you don't get in a fight about abolishing the home mortgage and abolishing, whatever other advantages you like. And you say, look, if you think you do better with the current, 100,000 page system, fine. If you'd rather give up paying your lawyer, paying your accountant, and just have a very simple form, fine, you choose. And then see what would happen over a 5 or 10 year period. I think that model is actually a very attractive model because I think it could be done. And I think you'd rapidly see most people decide it ain't worth fighting over this stuff. I'd rather have lower tax rates in a very, very simple system where I'm guaranteed that I'm actually taken care of. Without paying, I think the numbers now are $200 billion a year for lawyers and accountants and bookkeeping. Yes.
Hi, gadget student from India. What I predominantly think is all the changes you are suggesting are centered around the IT technology. And what my assessment is, rest of the world really missed out on the IT revolution, and they are basically following US. Now, on the next, in the next generation of science, I think three of the key technologies which can be really dominating, will dominate the technology of world. One is the energy independence, as you mentioned. Second is nanotechnology. And third is stem cell research and related fields. Now, what I see is predominantly we are residing in a circle where we are comfortable, that is IT. Now, in the nanotechnology, already the expense of research investment of Western Europe and Japan has exceeded US investment. In stem cell research, the other countries are jumping on that because they realize that there is a huge payoff and they are ready to compromise their belief and whatever the religion in against the amount of payoff they can receive from here. And in the fuel technology, what I perceive is there is not enough amount of private organization initiative. Now, given that in IT will dominate for next, say, 20, 30 years, how we are planning to take care of the rest of these three?
Well, let me say, first of all, I have strongly favored substantial investment in nanoscale science and technology, and I think it's an area where we are certainly competitive with the world. But again, I think if you don't have very dramatic change in your math and science learning system, you're not going to produce enough people who are capable of sustaining this. On stem cells, if you actually, despite the political infighting in Washington and all the name calling, if you actually look at the total amount of money spent by the state of California, the state of New Jersey, the state of Wisconsin, the total amount spent in the U.S. on stem cell research is vastly greater than anywhere else in the world. Again, the argument is over the National Institutes of Health and the standards for directly tax-funded money. But if you look nationwide, there is a substantial amount of work underway. And in fact, there are a lot of breakthroughs that don't involve stem cells in the politically charged sense. I just talked to somebody yesterday who thinks that they're very close to a breakthrough in regenerable pancreatic cells for diabetes, for example. That has nothing to do with stem cell research. It has to do with going straight at the cells inside your own body. But I think we will do that. I very strongly support what Senator Lamar Alexander is doing. He has a series of bills that now have 66 co-sponsors, and I really hope the Congress will pass them this year that strengthen education and strengthen investment in research. I'd like to see us make the R&D tax credit permanent and maximize the investment in research and development. I helped Congressman Wolf and Senator Warner develop a bill which allows the first $10,000 in interest on your student loans to be waived if you major in math and science. And I think those are examples of the kind of steps in the right direction. I think we just need a lot of steps in that direction.
It was interesting to hear all your examples of how there's great companies like eBay and Amazon that do things very efficiently, and to maybe use those as ways to do government operations more efficiently. How are you going to deal with the security issues in that? Because like with the Dubai Ports deal, that was an instance of using some private operation to do a job that deals with kind of like almost government-like stuff of importing and exporting.
Well, you can have government regulation of private behavior with very high accuracy. We have a system for, I used to be the ranking member on the subcommittee. We have a system for aviation safety where the private airline manufacturer, Boeing, builds an airplane to specifications. A private company, United or Southwest or whoever, flies the airplane and maintains it to specifications. And the net effect is that we've had enormous churning in the aviation market, but we've had no increase in airline crashes. Because but the government doesn't try to do the safety, it tries to inspect the safety. If I thought that we had an effective homeland security system for inspecting the ports, I wouldn't care if Dubai ports ran the port. But nobody believes the current government structures are capable of being effective at inspecting. I've said publicly that I favor a temporary or a worker visa program for people who want to come to the U.S. to work, and I would insist that they have a background check and that they sign a contract and that they give us a biometric for a card, probably a retinal scan. But I would outsource that into our program to MasterCard or Visa or American Express, because I don't think there's any hope the government could run it. But the government could set the standards and the government could inspect it. And so I'm very much against the government insourcing work to be done by the government because it is stunningly inefficient and bureaucratic. One or two last questions. Yes, sir.
Good morning, sir. One of the ways to compete against globalization with China and India is for the US to retain their best and the brightest talent who come here as international students and make it easier for those high-skilled immigrants to obtain their green cards and citizenships. As you know, the current comprehensive immigration reform bill that's being debated in the Senate and hopefully will be passed by Memorial Day has provisions to that effect. Can you share your thoughts on that issue? And if you could assure the student body comprising of many international students that you will use your influence and political capital to ensure that these provisions will not be stripped during the conference with the House? Thanks.
Yeah, no, I think a provision that says that if you've come to an American university and you graduate from American university, part of your graduation is the ability to get a worker visa program as an automatic thing should be a no-brainer for the country. I mean, why would you want to bring people over, invest in their learning an immense amount, and then not allow them to add value to the United States? And so I think that should be almost an automatic capacity, particularly because those are the people you most know are okay because they've now been here 3, 4, 5, or 6 years, and you know who they are and you know what their behaviors have been. And then, I would have certain requirements. You couldn't have committed a felony while you were in graduate school or something. But with that, one last question.
Mr. Speaker, this is our traditional way of ending, and being a professor, I think it's one you'll probably enjoy. Let's close on this question. What advice do you have for our young people as they go toward all the things you've been talking about?
Well, I have a standard set of 5 phrases that I write actually for people younger than you, but I think since you came to a globalization class, it sort of fits you. And they're very simple, but I derived them trying to think about what have I really learned about life back when I used to visit classrooms and talk to students, and I realized that for most of them, if you're in the 6th grade, you actually don't care what a congressman does. But you're kind of glad to have him there talking instead of your teacher, but you're not, I was just sort of a living show and tell kind of experience. But here are the 5 rules I want to leave you with that I really do talk about. I'm thinking about writing a book on them someday. They're very simple. Dream big, work hard, learn every day, enjoy life, and be true to yourself. If you don't dream big, why would you expect to achieve anything? If you don't work hard, you'll never make your dreams come true. If you don't learn every day, the hard work won't work because the world's too complicated for you not to learn. If you don't enjoy life, you're not going to be able to sustain dreaming big and working hard and learning every day because you can't force yourself to do things you hate. And in the end, if you're not true to yourself, why would you expect anyone else to respect you? And so that to me is sort of the framework I try to get young people to move into and to think about for the future. It's an honor to be allowed to come and to share ideas with you, and I look forward to hearing from you. Thank you very much.